Hey there, soon-to-be parents! Today we are diving into the topic of synthetic oxytocin, also known as Pitocin. And no matter where you are in the Western world, Pitocin augmentation is very often used during hospital births, especially if mothers opt for epidural anesthesia. And in this video now we will explore what Pitocin is, why it is used so frequently, we discuss its benefits and potential risks and the differences with the natural oxytocin hormone that your body produces during labor. I am Kate Rax, a doula, a Lama's childbirth educator and a mom of two amazing girls. My mission is to empower you to make informed decisions about your birth experience, ensuring that it is truly your day and not just a routine delivery. And for that you can find a wealth of variable information on my website, which is the www.ownyourbirth.com. And there you can also find evidence-based childbirth education programs. And don't forget to subscribe to my free childbirth workshop for practical tips to make your birth smoother and more enjoyable. But let's get back to Pitocin. So first, let's understand oxytocin hormone. It is also often called the love hormone because it surges when we are in love, when we hug or have a kind of intimate skin contact. And during labor, oxytocin triggers those rhythmic uterine contractions that restructure the uterus and that open up the cervix. And now there is a myth that activities like sex or belly rubbing could increase premature labor due to oxytocin. But please do not worry, mamas, because it's just an urban legend without any foundation. So it is true that oxytocin levels do increase slightly during sex, but as long as the uterus is not ready for labor, the elevated oxytocin hormone levels cannot simply trigger contractions because simply there are no sufficient receptors on your uterus to catch those oxytocin molecules. So oxytocin is a hormone and it is produced by the pituitary gland, which is deep in your brain. And then as labor progresses, more and more oxytocin is produced, leading to more frequent, longer and stronger contractions. And then the pain feedback and those high oxytocin levels, they eventually trigger the release of another hormone, which is called endorphin. And those endorphins, they act as a natural painkillers, alleviate pain, and they really lure laboring women into a kind of labor la-la land when women are turning inwards, they close their eyes and really behaving as if a bit drugged and as if not fully present. But now what about Pitocin? So Pitocin is just the synthetic version of oxytocin hormone, and chemically it is 100% identical to the natural oxytocin hormone, and of course Pitocin that also triggers the contractions of the uterus. Therefore, Pitocin is typically used as part of labor induction protocols or to strengthen contractions to augment labor. However, there are very important differences between the way how natural oxytocin hormone and how Pitocin behaves, and as an expectant parent it is really important to know the differences, to understand the differences, especially if you aim for an unmedicated natural birth. Well, the biggest difference between Pitocin and the natural oxytocin hormone, what your body produces, is that Pitocin is directly injected into your bloodstream and cannot reach your brain because of a protective mechanism which is called the blood-brain barrier. And you can think of the blood-brain barrier as a kind of one-way gate. It just blocks certain chemicals, certain molecules from entering the brain to protect it from possible harm. So oxytocin molecules simply cannot pass through this gate towards the brain. And the natural oxytocin, on the other hand, that is produced directly right in the brain where it triggers this endorphin production. And since IV Pitocin does not reach the brain, it cannot trigger the endorphin reaction there. So that's why labor with Pitocin and augmented labor with Pitocin is typically more painful. Also, it is important to know that if Pitocin is administered for too long and in too high amounts, then those uterine receptors may become saturated and become kind of insensitive to the high oxytocin levels and simply stop responding, and then contractions simply stop. And think of it somewhat like this. You might enjoy eating 1 or 2 slices of cake, but if you suddenly have to eat an entire tray of cakes, well, you might start feeling nauseous and completely fed up with the otherwise delicious cake. So after a while, if the uterus is really bombarded with too much oxytocin molecules too soon, then the uterus becomes like fed up, and then contraction stops. Pitocin augmentation does not help anymore, and such situations typically end, unfortunately, in the operating theater. And then what is the third important difference between Pitocin and natural oxytocin? Well, during labor, your pituitary gland produces more and more oxytocin, so contractions are gradually becoming stronger, longer, and closer together. And this progressing process that helps you to get used to those contractions, to tune in physically and mentally into labor, and to develop your own individual strategy for coping with contractions. However, with intravenous Pitocin, they really jumpstart this whole process, and depending on the dose, contractions may become all of a sudden strong, frequent, and quite long, and it might be quite challenging to cope with this. Another point to consider about Pitocin is that these suddenly intense contractions, they might be difficult also for your baby to cope with. So the baby may respond to Pitocin augmentation with non-reassuring heart rate, which may require further interventions and potentially even immediate surgical birth. Another risk which is not to be underestimated when it comes to Pitocin is that the effects of Pitocin must be monitored to avoid overstimulation of the uterus and potential harm to the baby. So both the baby's reactions and the uterine contractions must be closely monitored when labor is augmented with Pitocin, and that is why a continuous electric fetal monitoring is essential with augmentation. However, continuous monitoring that typically requires also laying in the bed. And laying in the bed simply makes contractions even more painful, and it's more difficult to cope with labor. Okay, but now we saw the risk, and let us now see also the typical cases when Pitocin becomes necessary. Well, very often Pitocin is used as part of labor induction, as part of the labor induction protocol. And once the cervix is ripe or has been ripened at first place in the process, and once the membranes are typically ruptured, and if contractions still do not start and do not progress within a given time frame, then typically the next step in the induction protocols is Pitocin to trigger those contractions. However, it is good to remember that Pitocin is hardly ever the first resolution to induce labor. So typically there are various steps before Pitocin. But Pitocin is also very common with epidurals, especially if the epidural is placed for a longer period. And often because of the elimination of the pain sensation, the pituitary gland just simply stops producing those increasing amounts of natural oxytocin hormone, and then contractions slow down or labor may even stop. And in such cases, the typical intervention is Pitocin augmentation to trigger the uterus to work again, to contract again. Okay, so far we have been talking about Pitocin augmentation during labor. But the synthetic oxytocin is often used also to support the birth of the placenta. And this is so common that in many hospitals in the US it is part of their protocol, even if the birth itself otherwise is completely natural and completely unmedicated. However, in other countries it is only used if there is a concern about blood loss. And in such cases, a single oxytocin injection is given into the muscle immediately after the birth of the baby to prevent this postpartum hemorrhage, so this excess bleeding. And that single shot that triggers immediate uterine contractions, and that speeds up the detachment of the placenta and the delivery of the placenta. However, in such cases, it is typically just one single shot, and although the contractions will likely be quite intense, in some situation you need to know that it can save even mothers' lives. So now, if you wish to know more, not just about Pitocin, but really be prepared to make your birth choices really consciously, to shape your birth according to your values, to your preferences, then just visit my website, which is the www.ownyourbirth.com, where I help your preparations with evidence-based online childbirth education programs. And if you are on my website, please do not forget to subscribe to my free childbirth workshop, where I give you practical tips to make your birth smoother and more enjoyable. So thank you for tuning in. See you next time. Bye bye.